The Chinese Cosmos, a very brief look at Chinese spirituality, cosmology, and philosophy. So this is the intellectual, cultural part of our coverage of China, whereas you've already had, or are having at the same time, the political discussion of the dynasties and those developments. Okay, popular religion. Popular religion is the common beliefs among the people. They're widely shared, but they're not usually part of an official doctrine. Though, in point of fact, official doctrine religions, organized religions, can pick up some of those popular beliefs and sort of integrate them into the practices. I think the best way to think about the difference between what we might call an organized religion and a popular religion in this sense is to think about codes of behavior or rules of behavior. Every society has rules about how people should behave, things that people can do, things that people can't do, things that they'll get in trouble with, and things that they'll get punished for doing. And in some of those societies, those codes of behaviors are written laws that have been passed as an edict by a king. So in like 666 BCE, King so-and-so said it was illegal to do this, and this will be the punishment. Or possibly passed in a code of laws passed by a legislature, like our Congress. That's a written code of laws. Some societies, though, don't have written codes of laws. Instead, what they have are rules of behavior that are based on traditions and popular custom. And so in that society, once again, everybody knows there's certain kinds of behaviors you should not do, you cannot do, and for which you'll be punished. But what those behaviors are and the proper way that they're going to be dealt with and punished are developed out of patterns of tradition. And so in that case, you would go to a judge if you were the person in trouble, and instead of the judge saying, well, under statute such and such, you've done wrong, instead they'll be saying, you have violated our tradition that you cannot do this. So there's still a code of behavior, but it has two different sources. Popular religion is like that. You have the religions, organized religions, that come with written texts, with specific doctrines, with a hierarchy of religious worshipers, monasteries, churches, synagogues, mosques, things like that. And those are sort of more the official doctrinal religions. And then you have the popular religions that grow from the bottom up, that in essence, they're built in the traditions, the habits, the common beliefs of the people. And so they're still powerful, they're still spiritual beliefs. Every society, as far as we can tell, has some kind of spiritual beliefs, but they come from a different source. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to be talking about popular beliefs of that kind, though not exclusively. Part of this popular belief is a belief about how the structure of the universe works. And this is so powerful that it actually gets incorporated into most of the formal philosophical and spiritual systems that develop in China, or adapt in China. And at the heart of it is the belief that the universe is made out of one substance, qi. Everything is made out of qi. Humans are made out of qi. Gods are made out of qi. Dirt is made out of qi. Plants are made out of qi. Water is made out of qi. You get it. Everything is made out of qi. And all of that qi has sort of two modes of being, yin and yang. So if you're made up of qi, you're made up of a mixture of yin and yang. And everything is a mixture of yin and yang. I do the same list all over again. And in some beings or some things, yin dominates, and in some others, yang dominates. The difference between yin and yang is a long series of oppositions. So, yang, day, yin, night, yang, active, yin, passive, yang, sun, yin, moon, yang, man, yin, woman, yang, father, yin, child, yang, heaven, yin, earth, yang, speech, yin, silence, So in all of these cases, you have a complementary relationship, okay? They're opposites of each other. A couple of things to keep in mind, though, is first of all, on the whole, yang is more actively valuable, okay? So if you look at these oppositions, you'll notice that man, father, sort of the powerful, active dimensions are all given to yang compared to yin, which is much more passive, submissive in belief. At the same time, though, even though these are opposites, they are not divided along the lines of good and bad. So if you remember Zoroastrianism, where everything's either helping for good or helping for bad, that's not the case here. Everything is divided, but it's divided into types of being, not into good versus evil. And that's a really important distinction to keep in mind. And also, just to remind you, you can see pretty clearly where that fits into thinking about the social order, right? The yang, people who have the yang dominant, in other words, men, are supposed to be the superior force in society. This system means that humans, gods, spirits, demons, they're all made out of the same substance. And this is important because if you think about monotheism, so for example, Judaism, there's a big division there, and that big division is between human beings and God. And humans are one kind of thing, and God is something very different. God is a completely opposite thing to what that humans are made out of. In this case, gods are more powerful, but they're not categorically different from humans. And in fact, some human beings, some human spirits, eventually may have the potential to become a god or to become a demon over time. So you're still seeing a range of power and a range of orientation. Demons are usually not helpful, though there's some exceptions. But you aren't seeing a vast categorical difference between them the way you are with monotheism. In this system, gods and spirits are a lot closer to human beings than you would see with a monotheistic way of looking at it. Ancestor veneration, also called ancestor worship frequently, though I don't like that because I think it's misleading. Okay, what this means is it's something that ties the family together across time. And the way it does that is this, is what you have here in this picture, you're seeing a family, the oldest son is getting ready to go off into the world, and so they're making offerings to the ancestor, hoping that will encourage the spirit of the ancestor to look after this young man. How this system works is you have the ancestors, and when the ancestors go into the spirit world after death, they are still connected to the family. And if the family gives to them, supports them, makes sacrificial offerings to them, they will maintain that connection to the family and continue to watch over the family. It's important to keep in mind, by the way, I think when we talk sacrifice, often people nowadays, people coming from a Christian tradition will hear the word sacrifice, and you sort of think big, huge, necessarily human sacrifice, large sacrifices of animals. And that's not to say that kind of thing doesn't happen. But for most cases, what you're talking about when you talk about sacrificial offerings is something like what we're seeing right here, in that offering a little bit of the food that the family eats, particularly if it's from a celebration or a feast or an occasion or festival, like a wedding. Offering some things that are pleasant, like flowers, things that can offer pleasure. So things of value, but usually if you're looking at a household like this, you're offering things that are of value to the people in your family, okay? Maybe kings, you're talking about a whole different ballgame, but for the average person, you're making offerings that keep your ancestor tied to you. This also ties you to the future, by the way, because if the system is founded on looking after the ancestors, you always have to have a generation to look after the ancestors. So part of you looking after your ancestors is also having a son who can look after your ancestors and you when you're gone. So you always have to keep moving into the future. And by the way, this is a system in which historically girls don't help. Girls will not look after their ancestors because when a girl grows up and gets married, she becomes a member of her husband's family. And she therefore looks after and helps care for her husband's ancestors. So you have to have a son to keep the system moving forward. And that's probably one of the reasons why Chinese society historically will have adoption as an option for childless couples, or at least couples without sons, as well as other methods of bringing an alternative wife in the home, various ways of making sure you have that son to carry on to the next generation. By the way, there's a penalty too in popular belief that if you do not look after your ancestors, you have the danger of them becoming hungry ghosts and turning on the family and punishing them. So this is a way of linking them to the family world. How this is interpreted depends on the individual doing it. A true Confucianist, and we'll talk about, you'll learn about Confucianism in the Confucianism lecture, but a true follower of Confucius might look at this and say, this is important because this is what my ancestors have always done. This is the tradition of our people, it's a right, it's important to perform this to show yourself as a humane person. But maybe it won't have a lot of belief in, that this is actually tying you to the spiritual world. Others will take that spiritual connection very seriously. So it sort of depends on who the individual is, what this right means to them. Divination. Divination is something that the specialists are best at. Priests and shamans. Shamans being people who are seen as having a particular spiritual gift, ability to communicate with the spirit world. Interestingly enough, in really early Chinese society, there's some evidence that women may have often been shamans. As time goes on, they sort of lose that position, but it seems in really early times that may have been the case. Shamans, priests, are seen as having the special gift of communication and knowledge. And so what they will do is then they'll interpret spiritual guidance through rituals. And I think you read about interpreting tortoise shells. Basically, in this case, what you do to try to get guidance is that you mark the various symbols on the tortoise shell, then you put it in the fire, then you pull it out, and you see which symbols are cracked. And that will give you guidance into what comes next. In essence, all systems of divination, and most societies had them, are based on the idea that you're going to give the universe a chance to act, and then you interpret those actions according to a pattern which you've learned. So in this particular case, they're deliberately setting up a test. In other cases, people will divination work through observing the movements of the stars, observing the movements of plants and animals. There's a whole wide range of ways of doing it. An additional goal of this is to maintain balance and harmony in the cosmos. And so it's helping through divination, by getting spiritual guidance, that's hoping to help you to act in ways that the cosmos will approve of and will support. Another popular belief, though in this case it's also an official belief, it's supported by the emperors, is the mandate of heaven. And basically this comes back from the first change of dynasties, when you go from the Shang to the Zhou dynasty. And the reason for this is it's critical to have a way of explaining that change, because all of the Chinese dynasties pretty much agree that there is an empire of China, and that the various dynasties who rule over that Chinese empire are all connected. They're replacing each other and taking this throne. That it's not a new country's being born. Instead, it's simply a new ruler coming to the throne of this one place, China. Plus, they have an interest in believing and showing people that their dynasty, they're as rulers of China, that they are currently being guided by the divine forces of the universe, heaven, that ultimate force, and also their spirits and other spiritual forces as well. Because that's one of the ways that historically people have used to convince people to support them as ruler, right? I have the backing of the spiritual world. That's a way to show that I have power that will let me lead you well and maintain myself in control. So what are you going to do then? If the Shang have been saying that they have the backing of the spiritual world and they're very powerful ancestors and all of those things that kept them as the rulers, and now you're showing up and you're saying, well, we're the new rulers, we're the Zhou, we are the new people who are going to rule. How do you explain that change? What they come up with is this concept, mandate of heaven. And what that says is heaven is the ultimate force. And heaven chooses a new dynasty to rule when the last fails to rule justly. So this argument would be that, yes, the Shang were originally chosen by the spiritual forces. They were meant by heaven to rule. However, as time went on, the Shang became increasingly ineffective and corrupt. And usually what are used as evidence of this is growing rebellions among the people, growing bandit activity, floods, basically things going wrong. And those are evidence that the dynasty that is ruling is no longer doing it well, is no longer doing it justly, is no longer looking after the people. At that point, heaven will pick a new ruler, a new dynasty, to take over and replace them. So heaven picked the Zhou. And then later on, the Qin will say that heaven picked the Qin. And then the Han will say that heaven picked the Han. And it's just this ongoing justification for, we're still got the same government, we're still China, but this is how we justify that our rulers keep changing over time. So it's a very useful concept. And it, by the way, you're still talking about mandate of heaven all the way up until the revolution in 1912. CE. Okay. Philosophers and bureaucrats. And that's the title for this section of what we're going to be talking about. Where a lot of the beginnings of the schools of philosophy we're going to talk about here come from is they come from this period in the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou dynasty, like I talked about, they replaced the Shang, right? That they had the new mandate of heaven, so they took over. So they conquer, they consolidate the various city-states in the area that sort of become pretty much independent as the Shang fell apart. And they're really the first to set up an organized government bureaucracy. I mean, it's nothing compared to what's going to come later, but compared to the Shang, this is much more bureaucratic. The Shang tended to depend a lot on but basically it's much more bureaucratic. It's the beginning of the bureaucracy. And so if you have bureaucracy, you need bureaucrats. So it's the beginning of hiring people to work on running the government because of their skills as scribes, because of their skills at organization. So it's the beginning of bureaucrats as well. The Zhou dynasty, by the way, is going to become, for many later people, particularly Confucius and followers of Confucianism, the example of what an ideal dynasty would have been like. And so this is sort of looked back to as a golden age of time. However, like every other dynasty, the Zhou begins to fall apart. And so you get the Warring States period. And in the Warring States period, China basically fragments. And you have all these little states, right? Often city-states, which are competing with each other to absorb their neighbors, to become biggest, to become more powerful, and then ultimately the goal is they're competing to become the next dynasty that will take over, right? So they're trying to convince people that they have the mandate of heaven and show them that basically by conquering and winning and taking control. And in order to compete, they've got to do a lot of stuff to make themselves powerful. So there's a huge interest in using iron, and using iron to make weapons that are more powerful and more effective than ever before. Remember, Shang, their big technology is bronze. The big technology that we're seeing here in the Warring States period is the beginning of the use of iron for weapons and tools. You have the focus on developing walled cities. Once again, that's a new kind of technology as a way of protecting themselves from the constant warfare. A huge interest in improving agriculture, and so that you can grow more crops. If you can grow more crops, you can feed more people. If you can feed more people, you can have a bigger army. So this huge interest in agriculture, and then coming out of agriculture, a huge interest in developing and expanding the military. And so, like I said, to manage all of this, you've got to hire someone. And so the local states that are competing are hiring wandering scholar bureaucrats, basically, to be the people to do this kind of work. And so if you are someone who knows how to read and write, which not a lot of people did, you might travel, looking from state to state, looking for a better job that will hire you to help run these new local governments. Okay, and this could be, if you're not going to inherit your family's land, or if you're not that high in society, this is a good opportunity for you. And so people go from place to place looking for their next opportunity. And these wandering scholar bureaucrats are some of the people who begin to develop the ideas we're going to talk about, or at least write them down and organize them, start organizing them into a philosophy. The first we're going to mention of these philosophies is legalism. And the name should be pretty self-explanatory. One thing about legalism is it's really seen as coming most into effective use a little later on with the Qin dynasty. But the ideas are beginning to develop in this earlier period as these people struggle. And so at the heart of the concept of legalism is the goal is that they're going to create a science of human nature that is going to allow them effective government. So maybe think about it as proto-political science. And they need, the idea is if you can figure out human nature, if you can figure out how to control human nature, you can do all the goals you want to do to make your state prosper. You can get them to work on big public works projects. You can get written codes of laws. You can collect taxes. You can impose standardized money. You can grow your military and your military technology. You can conquer your neighbors. But in order to do all of those things, you need to control your people. And legalism says we can tell you how to control your people. The key principles that legalism holds by is, first of all human beings are corrupt, greedy, and selfish, regardless of status and education. In other words, it doesn't matter if this guy over here was born a peasant and that man over there was born a noble. When it comes right down to it, legalism says they are both have the potential to be corrupt if you give them power. You can't trust that simply because a man is educated, because a man was born from a noble family, you cannot trust that he will be non-corrupt as a government official. Just like you can't trust peasants not to be corrupt. Therefore, no one can be trusted. You can't just sort of say, well, I can trust him, he's my cousin, he's my cousin's son. Or I can trust him because he comes from a good family. It doesn't work like that. No one can actually be trusted. So instead of trust, what you need to do is you need to control people by giving them effective punishments and rewards. And I guess it maybe says something about human nature that legalists and the various states and later the dynasties that follow their advice are much better at coming up with punishments than they are at coming up with rewards. So their solution is pretty straightforward. A written code of law that includes everyone. Now, it's important to keep in mind this is not a written code of law that makes everybody equal. Very far from it. Your social status, just like in every other ancient society, determines the rules that you are under and that you must obey, and also the types of punishments that could be applied to you. However, what it does say is just because you're a member of the nobility, that does not save you from being under the law, is the argument. You may not have the same kind of punishments, you may have more rights, but you are still ultimately controlled by that written code of law. The second thing to notice about that too is it's written. So we talked before about things, rules of behavior coming either from the traditions of the people or coming from something that's written down. Well, the concept here is if it's a written code, that means it can be rational, it can be effective, rather than trusting the traditions of the people, which may just have grown up any which way. Secondly, you need an organized, centralized bureaucratic government to control all of this and to make it work. And the government will enforce the laws, it'll manage the people in programs like public works, it will develop the military, it will develop new irrigation systems. All those tasks that need to be done will be overseen and developed by the centralized bureaucratic government. Final thing, legalism is often seen as the opposite of Confucianism. Most of all, it's seen as the opposite of Confucianism by advocates of Confucius and by advocates of legalism themselves. They saw each other as bitter opponents. In reality, though, in practice, when we look later at the dynasties which claim to be Confucian in orientation, in terms of practical methods, a lot of it looks a lot like legalism. Okay. Confucius is the guy who is basically the founder of Confucianism as a school. He was an aristocratic, well-educated man, but he was a younger son. He didn't inherit anything. So he wandered around looking for work as an advisor and a government bureaucrat. He was hugely unsuccessful because he would get hired and then he would insult his employers and tell them how basically corrupt and stupid they were, and then they'd fire him. So he really didn't get anything done in terms of actually ruling anybody or helping rule anybody, but his ideas were really immensely intriguing to people. And so he had many students who learned from him, and they wrote down what he said. And then after he died, his students gathered together what they had written down of him saying in what's called the Analects. And so that's basically the various memories, the anecdotes of what Confucius had said and what his beliefs were. And for more about Confucius, the discussion about his ideas, please look online on Blackboard. There is a link that will take you to a presentation on Confucian teaching that's actually been put together by the Asia Society at Columbia. It's really good, really well done, and in that case you're actually listening to the people who are specifically experts in that field. Okay, Taoism, also known as Taoism. It's the same thing. It's said the same way, actually, either way. What's going on there is Chinese does not use the same alphabet as you are familiar with, the Latin alphabet that you're familiar with. So when you are using names and things like that, it's not just a matter of translating the concepts, it's a matter of transliteration, basically deciding what letters, or actually in this case what words, what that comes to in terms of the best way to write it in Latin writing. And so there has been a change where before the standard practice was Taoism, it's now Taoism, and some people still keep with the old way. Okay, the collection of ideas that go into Taoism don't really have an exact beginning. And when we were talking before about popular religion, popular beliefs, a lot of that goes into Taoism. And so there really isn't a starting place. But the people who sort of, where it begins to become consolidated and written down, the texts that people point to when they talk about the beginning of Taoism are the classic On the Way and Its Powers, the Tao Te Ching, which is attributed to Laozi, who is a pretty legendary figure, who is claimed to have been the author of the classic. It's not really clear if he existed. He may or may not have. He might actually be simply an aggregated figure. In other words, there were probably lots of people doing this kind of thinking that contributed to this book. Laozi is the name we call them. It's like Homer in terms of the Greek Iliad and Odyssey. And then Zhuangzi, which is named for its author. And in that case, it's actually, we've got pretty good evidence that there just wasn't just one guy who wrote it. But in his case, probably the person it's named after did exist. Okay? These two books pull together a lot of critical ideas. And then you have developing out of it first the followers of their philosophies, and then there actually are religious movements that are Taoist religious movements that develop in the 2nd century CE, and that are sort of found on that. And that's a lot of what you're going to see today. And in those cases, they often are founded on following a leader who will claim to have secret knowledge that they've gained through spiritual revelations. From Laozi, who by this point in time they're talking about as if he's a god. There's a variety of other groups that follow, but what really ties them together is this belief that there is a secret wisdom that those within the group know, and that through studying, through being in the group, through a variety of ways, through alchemy, that they can help gain the secret wisdom for themselves. Okay. Taoism itself is hugely diverse, whether we're talking about the religious movements or if we're talking about the general philosophy. And it's part of the problem is it's deliberately complex, hoping to provoke wisdom, provoke a person into wisdom through contradictions and unanswerable questions. So in this case, you have a very famous story, and this is a painting that was done later on to demonstrate this story. And I don't know how well you can see it, but there is a man sleeping, and then above him you have a couple of butterflies in this garden. And the story is that a certain Zhuangzi, that's the man who wrote that book, Zhuangzi dreamt that he was a butterfly fluttering here and there on a whim, happy and carefree, knowing nothing of Zhuangzi. Then all of a sudden he woke to find he was, beyond all doubt, Zhuangzi. Who knows if it was Zhuangzi dreaming of a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming of Zhuangzi? Zhuangzi and butterfly, clearly there's a difference. This is called the transformation of things. And the idea is by confronting that sort of unknowable contradiction, you are forced to gain wisdom. For Taoists, the beginning of everything is chaos. And this quote, once again, whenever I put these large quotes down, I don't expect you to write it down. I'm including it because I found it a really useful way of thinking about what there is. And so, to read it, for Taoists, the philosophical equivalent to the pre-imperial primordium is a state of chaotic wholeness. In that state, imagined as an uncarved block or as the beginning of life in the womb, nothing is lacking. Everything exists. Everything is possible. Before a stone is carved, there is no limit on the designs that may be cut. And before the fetus develops, the embryo can, in an organic worldview, develop into male or female. There is not yet any division into parts, any name to distinguish one thing from another. Once birth happens, once the stone is cut, however, the world descends into a state of imperfection. Rather than a mythological sin on the part of the first human beings, or an ontological separation of God from humanity, the Taoist version of the fall involves division into parts, the assigning of names, and the leveling of judgments injurious to life. And I think maybe what this is trying to get to here is there's a very common idea in a lot of societies that the beginning of everything was a state of chaos, where there just was chaos out there that contained the potential for everything. And most of the mythologies talk about how that chaos is then formed into things. Okay? But what Taoism says is, that chaos itself, that was the perfect nature. That's where it all begins, and that's where ultimately we all yearn to get back to, that sense of oneness. And in that sense of oneness, you're not going to distinguish between male or female, between carved and uncarved, between all the different possibilities, because they are all there at once. Okay, the Tao, and that's what it's named after. And the Tao basically means the way. And so you got to be careful here, because that same term, the way, can also be used in other contexts. So for example, Confucians, followers of Confucius, use Tao to refer to the proper and moral way to behave. So you may have a quote from Confucius in which he says the way is to do this or that, and just because it uses the word the way, that doesn't mean it's Taoist. Instead, they're just talking about a different way. So for Taoists, the way is the natural flow of the universe, how the universe ultimately wants to flow. And humans should act in ways that follow the flow of the universe. Okay, so they should, to the best of their abilities, adapt themselves to the natural flow, the natural change and flux that the universe acts in. Excessive ambitions, desires, and violence will all lead to acting against the Tao and lead to harm. Okay, because if you want something very much, if you take violent action to achieve that thing, then you're making yourself rigid. You're trying to follow a specific pattern, and you're not allowing yourself to go with the flow of the universe, which isn't going to be satisfied with just one specific thing. Instead, it's in this constant state of change. The goal is ultimately to be whole, like that uncarved block of wood back there in the primordial chaos that has all these different potentials, but it isn't limiting itself to being one thing or another. So that when it gets carved, the concept would be it might become a fork, or it might become a piece of firewood, or it might become a statue of the emperor. But while it remains an uncarved block of wood, all of those things, that fork, that statue, that kindling, all the plus many, many other things beyond, infinite in number, are all still there in potential until you carve it. One of the attractions of Taoism is the belief that's sort of common not only in this spirituality, but the belief that if you achieve the true oneness of the Tao, you achieve that perfection, that original perfection which is all potential. If you achieve that original perfection, you therefore are not going to end, because perfection doesn't end, and you will thus conquer death. And so there's many methods that people try to achieve this. Alchemy, diet, ritual, gymnastics, gaining access to secret knowledge. But in essence, it's this belief that through gaining spiritual enlightenment, the result will be physical transformation. And just one more thing here. Your textbook tells you that Taoism degenerates into peasant superstition, and I would object to that, by the way, both in terms of Taoism continues to be a complex and important idea in Chinese society for a very, very long time, but the other reason, too, is peasants have interesting ideas as well, and I don't think it's fair to simply describe them as superstitious. But anyways. So in summary, we've got our three philosophies. You've got legalism, which was mostly rejected as an official philosophy, but it helped shape the Chinese bureaucracy, which is going to play a really important role in the development of China as a society and empire. You have Confucianism. We didn't talk about the ideas behind Confucianism here, but it's going to be really critical for Chinese government and thinking and society into the 20th century CE. Okay, so for a very long time. around 2,500 years almost. And then you have Taoism, which plays an important part in the development of Chinese medicine and science, but also is an important part of common and elite spirituality. And that's it.